How come Americans generally don't complain about foreign tourists as much? I live in Southeast Asia, and there's a lot of dissent for foreign tourists here, blaming them for raising the cost of living for the locals and increased housing costs from short-term homestays like Airbnb. Based on my observation, this is quite prevalent in Europe as well, especially in popular European destinations. How come the dissent for tourists doesn't seem to be as prevalent in the US? A couple things: we're a really big country. So even though we get millions of foreign tourists every year, it's usually pretty easy for us to absorb them. We have stronger taboos against xenophobia. This is especially true in the urban areas where foreign tourists like to visit. For example, if a Barcelona-style group of anti-tourist protesters fired water guns at Asian tourist groups in New York or LA, there would be an immediate backlash and accusations of racism. We're a very diverse country. Thus, we often can't tell if someone is a tourist immediately. Much of the anger that at rising prices and perceived changes to the neighborhood gets blamed on other Americans from different regions. Foreign tourists usually don't come up in these discussions. We have stronger taboos against xenophobia. This is the big one to me, and the biggest culture shock when I've been to other countries. Other places will clock you as a foreigner right away and straight up demand to know where you're from. But most Americans consider that unthinkably rude. Even the ones who want to know for racist/xenophobic/etc. reasons will usually find an indirect way to ask, not just blurt out, "Where are you from?" implied, because you are obviously not from around here. What's funny about that is you'll find a lot of Americans will want to know where people are from, but it's generally a sincere curiosity about people or a way to make conversation rather than from a xenophobic mindset. Yes, I want to know where people are from because I like to know things, and I think other countries' cultures are interesting. That's literally the whole thing. I don't care where it is. Tell me about it. I want to ask questions and hear it all. Exactly. I, and most folks I know, ask out of genuine curiosity if the person has a unique accent that's noticeable. It's always interesting to hear the story if there is one. I quote also argue that the majority of foreign tourists, Canadians, Mexicans excluded, tend to visit only a handful of spots in the US like NYC, Louisiana, DC, SF, Hawaii, and maybe some Western national parks, minimizing the impact on the rest of the country. Also, the culture in those locations is heavily influenced by generations of immigration, and it's taboo to have some reflexive distaste for foreigners, including foreign tourists. It can happen, of course, but the mainstream culture in cities is overall welcoming. In Texas, foreign tourists are just something that barely exist. There aren't that many tourist attractions. The most popular one is the Alamo, and while the story is kinda cool, the site itself is pretty lame. And both of our national parks are very far from any major cities/airports. I've seen and met endless foreign tourists at Disney World and Universal in Orlando, South Beach in Miami, Pike Place Market in Seattle, French Quarter in New Orleans, Liberty Hall in Philadelphia, Aspen, Vail, Telluride, Jackson Hole, Steamboat Springs, everywhere in Hawaii, etc. Exactly, those are internationally known tourist destinations. They're not going to places like Toledo, Omaha, Sacramento, Pittsburgh, Alabama, or the suburbs anywhere. We actually get a ton of foreign tourists in Sacramento. There are tours from San Francisco that are marketed as Gold Country California tours that do a day trip from SF to Sac. They mostly tour the old Sacramento tourist spot and the Capitol building. They mostly come in the spring and fall, because no one wants to be here during the summer when it's 105 degrees. And for most of the time there's a ton of tourists from the US in any of the big areas. When I go to NOLA or Chicago, etc., I'm just as much a tourist as someone from Turkey. Or Japan. NOLA is insane. It's a city of 369,000 that gets close to 20 million visitors a year. As a New Yorker, I think that's what made it so enjoyable for me. The locals don't give a fuck about you or where you're from. No southern small talk or bullshit at the counter, just yes sir, no sir, have a good day. Seriously, #3. That's the beauty of the US. Could be a full-blooded citizen regardless. 4 is what stood out to me. The number of foreign tourists has to be tiny compared to domestic tourists. When you go to NOLA, the locals don't care where you're from. If you're staying in an Airbnb, you're an asshole. If anything, Americans will get it worse because they should know better.